Hello, my name is Ariel like the mermaid. A lot of people nowadays seem to have a growing frustration about political correctness. A lot of people seem to feel that political correctness limits how we can speak, and that everyone has to be so careful about what we say nowadays because people might get offended. And a lot of people feel that political correctness limits comedy, like that you can't now we can't laugh at certain things because it might be offensive. But why does political correctness exist, and is there any purpose for political correctness in our society? If someone's trying to be politically correct, they're generally trying to avoid offending certain groups of people. But more than simply not offending certain groups of people, political correctness is about avoiding demeaning and belittling certain groups of people that face oppression. And it's also about discouraging bigoted ways of thinking. But there certainly can be problems if political correctness is taken too far. Sometimes art and other forms of expression that offend us might also help us think about things in a different way. And it's very important that the government can't limit our freedom of speech and our freedom of expression, and that we can't have our freedom of speech and our freedom of expression limited by threats of violence and fear. One art form that political correctness often clashes with is humor and satire. I think it's when this clash usually happens, it's often when humorists decide to take on serious issues in a humorous way. And I think that the reason why a lot of people take offense to this is because I think there's an assumption that if you are dealing with something using comedy and using humor and using satire, that means you are trivializing that thing. And this isn't always true. It doesn't necessarily... You can deal with something using humor without necessarily trivializing an issue. However, that doesn't mean that this kind of instinct to not like, jokes being made about certain subjects is not completely unfounded, because sometimes there is a lot of humor that does trivialize certain things. A lot of people don't really like the idea of making jokes about rape, or about making jokes about suicide, for example. And there definitely is a good reason why a lot of people don't like the idea of making jokes about these subjects, because these are issues that are very serious and have very serious implications and have a lot of emotions around them, but also are things that society often trivializes, and are often trivialized in the way that we speak about them. A lot of times people will talk about suicide in a very trivialized way, like, oh, why don't you go kill yourself, or I'm gonna kill myself if this doesn't happen, or something like that. A lot of people take objection to rape jokes because rape culture is a very real thing, and victim blaming is a very real thing, and a lot of people do trivialize rape, and a lot of people don't take the idea of sexual violence with the amount of seriousness that it should be taken with. And often rape jokes are a big part of rape culture. I think that kind of people, joking about like, oh, what if, I don't know, and people oftentimes, if there's casual jokes, if casual jokes are just part of a vernacular, then that does kind of normalize the idea of rape, and it normalizes the idea of someone taking advantage of another person. A lot of people think you can't really make any joke about these, kind of topics that are very, very serious, but I would argue, I think you can deal with really, really serious topics with using satire and using humor, as long as you aren't trivializing the issue. And it's a very delicate thing, and I think when it is a very serious issue, I think you should, if you're, a comedian, I think you should really know how to deal with that issue in a very delicate way and understand the implications of dealing with this issue. For example, I think if you were dealing with rape in a satirical way, the question is, are you trivializing rape, or are you satirizing, or are you kind of making, is the joke just like, oh, haha, rape is funny, which, it's not, or are you satirizing, for example, are you satirizing rape culture? Are you satirizing the way a lot of people view rape, and the way a lot of people trivialize rape? For example, I remember there was a really, there was a kind of clever satirical video made by The Onion, a while ago, that really satirized rape culture. It was kind of satirizing a news report where a football player was caught raping someone, but then they kind of treat it like, oh, well, oh, this person, even though they were accused of this, they managed to overcome that, which is obviously the totally warped perspective to take on that kind of an issue. But with that kind of satirical thing, it kind of criticizes the way a lot of times rape is dealt with in the media, and a lot of times they try to bring sympathy, especially when it's young people. A lot of times the media will kind of bring more sympathy to the perpetrators of rape rather than to the victims of rape. And I think that was a kind of a clever way of bringing light to the issue in a humorous way. But I don't think it trivialized rape. I think it was a very clever satirical way of satirizing rape culture, and I think there should be a distinguish. I think you can use satire and you can use humor to deal with serious issues, but I think that I think that sometimes you just have to know how to deal with it with care, and I think you do have to recognize that some people are going to be offended. I mean, there's a lot of people that probably say that you can't make any kinds of jokes about rape, but that might be where I would differ with some people. I mean, I think that it's really hard, but there's a difference between making jokes that trivialize something and jokes that just deal with an issue. For example, a big thing that I think oftentimes people are criticized for in comedy is stereotypes. Humor that uses like ethnic stereotypes and maybe like gay stereotypes, or just almost any kinds of stereotypes. And what I would say is, I think that that is something that someone who is a comedian should be mindful of, is the idea of stereotypes. When it comes to stereotypes in humor, I think the question is, are you affirming these stereotypes? Are you kind of are you encouraging these stereotypes to exist, or are you just satirizing the stereotype? Are you kind of poking fun at the idea of the stereotype? And I think there's a difference, but I think a lot of people think that you can just make a stereotype. And I mean, the thing is, I think a lot of people find stereotypes funny, but I think it's I think that the question is, I think it's sometimes people don't really, can easily go like, oh, well, you know what, it's a I mean, it's just comedy, it's not meant to be taken seriously, and there's a side, that maybe that's to some degree is true, but not everybody. If you see it enough, even if it's in a comedic thing, I think a lot of times these stereotypes it does kind of affect the way you think about people. If you see enough portrayals of a certain group of people in a certain way, it does become a real thing that affects the way you think about that group of people. Particularly with humor, I think it shouldn't be. I mean, because a lot of times, there's some stuff I have found funny that maybe I wouldn't really be proud to admit that I found it funny, but I did find it funny. And I think that's the kind of, but I think that it's, a lot of people don't like to think about comedy in a critical way, and don't really like to question why they find something funny, because like a lot of people feel that takes away from the humor. But I think there is value in kind of questioning, well, oh, I found that thing funny, but why did I find that funny? What is it about that I found funny? I think that you should always kind of question things. I don't think you should just take things for granted. I think that the great thing about comedy is it can actually offer you new ways to think about something, and particularly satire, I think, because satire often will kind of take something to an extreme, like, in a way that's, obviously we all generally most people wouldn't think. Like The Onion does this all the time. Will it kind of take something to an extreme that clearly isn't true? But I think you shouldn't just go like, ha ha ha, that's really funny. Like, you can actually kind of think about like, oh, but is there any kind of truth? Do people actually sometimes go close to that extreme? Or is there I think sometimes there's value in thinking about things critically and thinking about humor critically. I think another thing that can be kind of problematic about political correctness is sometimes it becomes about like categorizing into what is okay to say and what is not okay to say, or what is okay, what kind of artistic expression is okay and what kind of artistic expression is not okay. And I think that trying to categorize what is okay and what is not okay in our expression in really simple kind of categories of what's okay and what's not is just not realistic, and is just kind of missing the point about about political correctness, about kind of being mindful of what we say and being mindful of what we do, what kind of artistic expression we put out there, what kind, just in general, what kind of any expression we put out there. Especially if it comes down to like what words are okay. If we just have our list of like words that are okay to refer to certain people by, and then our lists of words that are not okay, the thing is it's not acknowledging the fact that what words are okay to say. Like the idea of a bad word, just any kind of word that is bad, is all just societal, and it's something that can frequently evolve, because as our language evolves, our language is constantly evolving, and constantly new words are acceptable and new words are not acceptable. Certain words get reclaimed, and there's all sorts of things that happen with that, and I think we have to acknowledge that sometimes that language can evolve, and we can't always just we're kind of hindering that kind of evolution of language if we're just saying, oh no, these are okay, these are not okay. And also it's missing the point, because at the end of the day, it's not what word you're saying that really is what matters. It's the idea behind the words that you say. That's not to say that certain words don't have, the words don't have power. No, because it's through these words that we convey certain ideas. But if we focus too much on the particular words people are saying, we're not putting enough emphasis on what they're actually trying to say with these words. Because a lot of times people can say bigoted things while staying in kind of these. If you make simple rules of political correctness, you can easily kind of stay in these rules, and you can easily kind of say bigoted things without necessarily being politically incorrect. I think sometimes it's important to know that sometimes I think it's the small things that have more of an impact than sometimes the big things. I mean, the big things, that's not to say that the big things don't matter, but a lot of times the small things can have a bigger impact than the big things, because the big things are things that we can easily recognize. We can easily, if someone says a just horribly bigoted statement, like if someone said, oh, all the gays should be killed, well, we can obviously see that that's a bigoted statement, because it's just, of course it's bigoted. You're saying that a group of people should be killed. That's just completely unacceptable. But in some ways, in some ways we would recognize if someone calls someone a faggot, because that's a slur, that we're more likely to recognize, oh, that's really homophobic, that's really bad. But in some ways I'd argue that it's almost worse to say call something gay in a negative way, and that has almost a worse impact than saying the word faggot, arguably, because when you're calling something gay and you mean a negative, you're using a word that a group of people uses to refer to themselves, and you're using that, you're associating that with negativity. Now, obviously, calling someone a faggot is more offensive, but even though the smaller thing, going like, oh, that thing's really gay, that seems like a really small thing, but that really does have an impact on how you think. It creates an association, between gay and not good. And if other people hear that, particularly if someone who isn't out as gay hears that, or even someone who is out as gay, someone who is queer hears you making that association between gay and negative, then that creates a certain association, and that person might make an assumption about you, that you think that things that are gay are not good, and that and it kind of might create a certain association with them between gay and not so great. And that's not good, and that is something that does kind of encourage bigotry. Now, the hard thing about these small things is it's really hard to kind of say what's okay and what's not with them, because it's really most of the people who say like small things that are like, or if someone, kind of makes a small statement about, and using like the correct terms or whatever, but, says something that kind of makes a generalization about black people, for example. It's hard to completely police these, because at the end of the day, a lot of people who make these statements don't have like bigoted intentions completely, but still the language that they use is harmful, because it still creates these associations, and it encourages certain associations between certain things in certain groups of people and certain negative ideas. Sometimes with political correctness, I think sometimes it is good to teach people why what they're saying is problematic, and why, for example, like why it's not good to just associate the term gay with negativity. I think sometimes there is a value in, in explaining to people why that's not good. But I mean, sometimes, you can't always control what people are going to say, and sometimes people are going to say things that are offensive. And there are certain things that are the small things that do make a difference that that I try not to say, and I try to be mindful of certain ways I say things, because at the end of the day, what we say and how we say them does affect how people think about them. There's certain things that I'm trying to be mindful about, and I try to be careful about how I say things that I certainly wouldn't expect everyone to do, and I don't think it'd be reasonable for me to just completely, say, oh, well, you should, talk about this in this way. I mean, for example, I try to be very mindful about when I how I use gender in speech, and for example, I tried, if I was generally, if I'm addressing a group of people, I wouldn't want to go like, hey, boys and girls, or hey, ladies and gentlemen, things like that bring attention to the divide in gender. I just don't really like. I mean, it's not something I'm comfortable with. I mean, because it does, first of all, it disregards people who don't, non-binary people who don't identify as male or female, but it also, I think it really affirms the idea that it affirms like men and women, or boys and girls as separate groups of people. And I think that does, even though it seems really small and it's not necessarily like downright bigoted, things like that, like grouping people into boys and girls, it does affect how we think about gender, and that we think that, it's important for us to be kind of categorized as separate groups of people, always by male and female, things like that, or like even calling things like, oh, this is a like women's shirt, or these are men's shoes. I mean, I try to be personally, I try to be mindful of that, because I think it creates kind of these, it affirms kind of just standards of what is male and what is female, and I don't really like to affirm that, and so that's something I personally try to be careful about when I'm talking about, when I use gender in speech, and how often, I like make gender a part of my speech. I mean, I try to be mindful of that, but I certainly wouldn't expect, because it's something that's so drilled into our brains from a young age, I'm certainly not going to expect people to stop, saying certain expressions that like feature, I'm not expect people to stop saying like girls' night or boys' night, even though I don't really like, I certainly would never go like, hey, let's have a girls' night or a boys' night or whatever, because I don't really, I'm not really kind of comfortable with that kind of, idea of emphasizing, it's just one group of, gender, whatever. I mean, at the end of the day, people are going to, say what they're going to, that's a part, it's what, people, a lot of people do think in a very gendered way, and you can't really force people to think like you do. One thing I try to be mindful is, I've never really gotten into the habit of like calling things retarded, but I think from a pretty young age I was taught that it's not good to refer to things as retarded that you don't like. But I something that I recently kind of, I don't know what it was that really kind of made me think about this, but I actually try to avoid kind of all terms that refer to intelligence level, like in a negative way. including, like, I try to avoid saying words like idiot, moron, even stupid, and that's really hard, by the way, and I'm sure you can find tons of videos where I say stupid, because it's just sometimes you are like, this idea is really stupid, it's the only kind of word you can think to criticize something. But I think it's just kind of like, I think sometimes it's more powerful. I think a lot of times it's not even just about I don't know, the idea of associating negativity with intelligence level. I mean, I think sometimes it's also, sometimes you could just find a better word. Like if you're talking about, instead of like that argument is stupid, sometimes like that argument is illogical, or that argument is flawed, or something. There's like, sometimes you can, and also I think sometimes like when you're calling something stupid, it more is likely that person will feel, a person who thinks like that will feel that you're like directly insulting them and you're calling them stupid. Whereas if you're actually more focusing on what the argument is or whatever, then it becomes more about that as opposed to like attacking the person. More like, oh, well, you're this way of thinking, I don't agree with this, or whatever. So I don't know, that's a thing I personally try to do, but certainly do I expect people to also do that? Not really. It's just kind of something that I thought of recently that I'm kind of like, well, I'm gonna try, to just be mindful of, because it's just a way of being thoughtful about what you say and what you say, like what kind of impact what you say has. Certainly I don't expect people to stop saying the word stupid or idiot or moron. People are going to say these kind of things, I understand that, but I mean, it's just something I try to be kind of like mindful of, and try to be kind of more aware of, what I'm saying. And I think it's good to be aware of what you're saying and not just recklessly saying whatever comes in your mind. The thing is, I think that free speech and free expression is very important. That's something that I really strongly believe. And I think that a lot of times, and that's something that political correctness, because political correctness is kind of about being mindful of what you're saying and what you're saying. So a lot of people do feel that political correctness is something that's always against free speech, and I think sometimes, to some degree, there's a good reason why a lot of people feel that way. If everything that was politically correct, that if we all were constantly trying to be politically correct, then our speech would be very, very, very limited. I think the reason why it's important that we don't try to, like, especially that we don't allow our government to be policing, and we be mindful how we're trying to police speeches. It's important that all views are able to be heard, and all views have an opportunity to be said, because even horribly bigoted views, I think it's important that sometimes we hear these views simply so that we know that they exist. If we live in constant denial that bigotry exists, then we're just going to allow it to occur. This is one of the reasons why a lot of times when I refer to certain slurs, particularly, certain slurs I don't really feel like I really have, I don't really feel comfortable using certain slurs because they're not slurs that apply to me, and I don't feel that it's my place to decide whether it's okay for me to say those slurs or not. And I try to be more careful about certain ones, but like with the words faggot and tranny, which are both terms that could, that apply to me because, I'm queer and I'm transgender. I don't like the idea of referring to these words or having to refer to these words as the F slur and the T slur, and I personally don't like to refer, if I'm talking about the word, I don't like to say T slur or F slur. The reason for that is because I feel like not being able to just say the word and creating this kind of thing where it's like, where I have to just refer to it by a letter, and where it can't be said even if I'm just talking about the word, if I'm not just casually using it, if I'm just saying what the word is in a discussion about the word. I think that creates, the problem with that is that it makes these words more powerful. If people are not allowed to say the word tranny and aren't allowed to say the word faggot at all, even when just discussing it. I think that when they are used, because there's going to be bigots and they're going to use these words, when they use these words, it just makes these words all the more horrible and all the more and all the more like, it makes us all the more vulnerable to these words, because we try to kind of like deny that they exist by like just not even saying the words. I think sometimes it's important to be able to say, yeah, that person, I think it's important for me if someone like in the comments, like, says, yeah, there's people in the comments that called me a tranny or called me a faggot or whatever. It's important that I, can just acknowledge that and not say, because if someone calls me that in the comments, not that this happens all that often, but occasionally I get, bigoted comments. If someone calls me a tranny or a faggot in the comment, they didn't call me they didn't call me T-slur, they didn't call me F-slur, they called me tranny or they called me faggot. It's a form of denying that the bigotry exists if we kind of limit even how we can just refer to, like certain bigoted terms. I mean, and I understand why a lot of people just don't want to hear the words at all, and I do sympathize with that, but I think it's important that we, the analogy I would use is kind of the Harry Potter, kind of using, in Harry Potter, there's a character Voldemort, and most of the wizards refer to him as either he who must not be named or as you-know-who, because they're just, it's like, they're so scared to even just speak his name. And I think that that's kind of, by avoiding speaking about certain slurs, even in a context where we're just having a discussion about slurs, I think, or just a discussion about bigotry in general, I think that that's kind of, it's a similar thing where if you're just afraid to even like to talk about, like, directly say what the bigotry is that is happening, then it doesn't really allow us to confront the bigotry, and it doesn't allow us to fully acknowledge what the bigotry is. I think with all this, I've mentioned, because I've been talking about what the shortcomings of the idea of political correctness. I think it's important to acknowledge, like in a lot of this I'm kind of referring to art or expression, and I think particularly with art, I think it's important to recognize though, that while there are some works of art and like, and there's like comedies and there's, all sorts of, in books and whatever, that are offensive and are, are kind of controversial and still like, and have like artistic value and have, and are important and are compelling and, make us think about issues in a different way. Just because something is controversial or something is offensive doesn't really make it a valuable piece of art. It doesn't make it something that is really, it does not make it something that's really going to make us think or is going to really change the way we kind of make us question things. I don't know, it just seems like a lot of times nowadays people kind of glorify like, ooh, it's a controversial movie, or, oh my gosh, that book is so controversial and edgy. Certain artists hear this and like, hear how a lot of times, because people like associate kind of controversial and, they have a certain association between controversial and offensive to something that's kind of interesting, because, if there's like kind of, people that are upset about this or offended by this, oh, it must be interesting, or it must be something that's, that's worth, looking into. Just for people who like, especially people who are creating any kind of art, if they're writing a book or you're making a movie or you're, or if you're a comedian telling jokes or whatever you're doing, just because something is offensive and controversial, first of all, it doesn't make it really good art, or it doesn't make it, of course, like all kind of art things are subjective, but, it certainly, it certainly doesn't, make it, art that's really valuable and, really, has, great significance simply just by being offensive. I guess the main thing I'm trying to say is, as a society, we can't always be just afraid of offending each other, because if we're too afraid of offending people, then we aren't really going to say anything. We're not going to make any forms of expression. We're not going to make any forms of art that are compelling if we're too afraid of offending each other, and we're too afraid of offending people. And I think it's necessary for us to evolve as a society to have dialogues that are difficult and have dialogues that might be offensive. And if I was totally afraid of being offensive, I couldn't make any of these videos, because and I can just dress the way I do, because the way I dress probably offends a lot of people. Just the fact that I'm wearing clothes that aren't really the clothes that my genitalia says I should be wearing. Things like that. The fact that I openly identify as trans and I openly identify as queer. Things like that. A lot of what I say, even some of the videos that aren't even that, I don't think are that offensive, someone's going to find offensive. Just to have a dialogue that'll, help us evolve, and have all kinds of dialogues that will help us evolve as a society. We need to be able to speak freely sometimes, and we need to be able to, sometimes maybe say things and do things that might make other people uncomfortable. But at the same time, I think it is important to recognize there is a reason why political correctness exists, and there's a reason why you sometimes should be mindful of what you say, and be mindful of what you're kind of putting out there, and why we should be critical of certain things, and why we should be able to point out, if something is offensive, if some sort of joke on a TV show kind of, makes you uncomfortable, or if you think it's not, it might be kind of, it might have certain harmful implications. Then I think we need to be able to recognize that, and we need to be able to call people out when they say certain things that are offensive, and we need to be able to bring attention to things like bigotry, all kinds of bigotry, and just things that are dividing us. What we say and what we do does have an impact, even if it's really small. The small things can really build up. And I think it's always, at the end of the day, the answer is not, I don't think is ever censorship. You do have to be mindful, because obviously the government should have no place in censorship, but there also is, even if a corporation, for example, if you have a television company and you're kind of limiting the content that a show can have, obviously that's your right, and you should be legally allowed to do that. But you should ask yourself, well, wait, should I be censoring this art? Should I really be constantly going like, oh, you can't say that, or you can't do this? Is that really a good thing to do? Because at the end of the day, it is important that people have outlets to express themselves, and even say and do things, and say and create art, or just express themselves in ways that might not be so popular. Sometimes we need to see things that might offend us, and that sometimes helps us think about things in a different way. Just recognize that what you say and what kind of things you put out there does have an impact, and I think the bottom line is just I think what we should encourage, instead of censoring things, is we should encourage people to think critically about things. Think, if something bothers you, ask yourself, why does it bother me? Why is this thing offending me? And, before you put something out there that might be controversial, kind of like educate yourself why people might be offended by it, why, and kind of evaluate, well, is this something I do really want to, if it's going to, why is it offending people? Is there a reason why this thing might offend people, for a good reason? Why is there, just thinking critically, about things, thinking, and not really turning off your brain when you're, creating things and you're putting things out there. For example, if someone was going to draw an image of Muhammad, obviously that should be protected by free speech, because, at the end of the day, just because, one religion says you can't do something doesn't mean that everyone else shouldn't be able to do it. But, I mean, if you're going to do that, you should recognize, that it is an offensive thing, and you should ask yourself, well, is it worth it? What is the pros and the cons? And not even, like, in terms of, like, violence, because, I mean, obviously, I don't believe that any forms of free speech should be limited by violence. I don't think that that's good if we're just saying, oh, well, if this, if I'm going to be hurt for something, then I should be, I should be careful, because that's not good, if we're just letting who is willing to be violent against us dictate what we say and what we do. But, ask yourself, if you're doing any kind of thing that might offend someone, educate yourself, understand why it offends people, and understand, have an understanding of why some people, wouldn't want you to do that, and if you still think it's worth it, and you still think that it's worth offending some people, then, because there's value in what you're doing, even if it does offend people, then go ahead and do that thing. I think that it's good, for example, if a TV show does something offensive, or if a movie does something offensive, I think it's great when people talk about it, and talk about, certain things, and certain tendencies. Sometimes certain things on their own, like, it might not be bad, it's not necessarily bad if one movie doesn't have, kind of empowering, if it doesn't have, like, female characters that are really significant to the plot, but, like, something like the Bechdel test, really the point of things like that is if there's a tendency, if there's kind of certain tendencies in art, then I think that's important to recognize that and think critically. Why aren't there as many female roles that aren't dependent on men? I think it's important to ask ourselves, these questions, and to constantly kind of question art and think about art, and also forms of art, and think about expression, and think about what we say, and not necessarily censor ourselves, or censor what people can say, or just try to make people feel afraid to say anything that might offend anyone, because I don't think that's valuable. But encouraging us to at least think before we do things, and think about what the implications of what we say are, I think is good.